Hello everybody, I'm Reyli COF, and my topic is going to be on gun control. And I know it's a little controversial. Mostly all the arguments today are about enforcing gun control and why it's so relevant, especially today. But I feel that we should be able to argue for both sides. So in my claim, I'm going to argue and support the main proposition that bans on assault rifles will fail to reduce homicide. My three supporting claims are the bans and how they have failed in the past, and how the bans and how the public in general are greatly affected, and the percentage of firearms being used throughout the years. So my first claim, bans on guns in the past have failed to reduce gun violence. In the mid-1970s, an act was brought up called Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975. It was passed in 1976 in Washington, D.C., which D.C. is known for having the most strict gun laws in the U.S. And a lot of my facts and statistical reports are coming from the Daily Wire, which they have written mostly through this particular act in previous articles. They have also reported that annual homicides rose from 188 in 1976 to 364 in 1988 after the ban had been passed, and then it also increased again from 454 in 1993. And then later, after being found unconstitutional by District of Columbia versus Heller, the ban was struck down because one of the main arguments were that if people in that area could not defend themselves from other criminals with weapons that obtained illegal weapons, then it would be unconstitutional for them, and that it was also infringing upon their Second Amendment right. Reports of homicides have steadily declined since then, after the ban had been struck down, to 88 yearly murders in 2012. My second claim is that a majority of public mass shootings in the U.S. Since 1950, approximately, have taken place in gun-free areas. Two researchers that have found did a statistical report. John R. Lott and William M. Landis. Lott being a researcher for the Crime Prevention Center, and Mr. Landis being a University of Chicago law researcher. They have found that right to carry laws in certain states reduce both the frequency and the severity of mass public shootings, which is a deterrence factor in which they found correlation. And another site called Everytown, which focused on statistical reports that focus on modern shootings and how they could analyze and prevent it. They have found that in 2018 alone, there have been 17 school shootings, and a total of 290 since 2013, shortly after Sandy Hook. And my third supporting claim is that through 22% of all violent crimes committed, an offender was wielding a weapon. So just 22%, which is a really low number for amount of crimes that have been happening. Obviously, which is gun, knives, and whatnot. And to the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, they have found that only 8% have involved firearms. So, in conclusion, having bans in general don't really do much to prevent people from going out and committing any homicides, because they can always go to the black market and get it there, and yeah, that's it.
All right, well, the proposition's clearly identified. The secondary points, you list 3 points, but they're not really claims. The third one, in fact, isn't a sentence. It's just a statistic. So I'm not exactly sure what inference we're supposed to draw from that. You need to make declarative statements for your claims. When you get to the first point, you basically talk about the futility of one piece of legislation that affected Washington, D.C. directly, and that's where I did hear some source citation being presented on the number of homicides that were taking place in the area over time, how that increased despite the law being in place. And then apparently after the Heller decision, where the law was overturned and presumably people were allowed to own weapons again, that there was another decrease that there was actually a decrease in the number of homicides in the area. That's okay. That was a little bit less clear. The other information you cited from the Daily Wire, I assume that information is probably from the same source, but it ought to be a little bit clearer. The quote from Lott and Landis talks about how right to carry laws have decreased mass shootings. That's a principle that they seem to have made based on their research, but I didn't get any statistical information there. It's just their conclusion based on whatever research they did. We're not getting their statistics. And then your Everytown quote, I'm not exactly sure how that information supports your position at all. It seems to suggest that the number of mass shootings is relatively high, 17 this year and 290 since 2013. How does that advance your position? It was not clear at all how that advanced the position. The last point seems to suggest that there is a problem making an inference that there is a danger from firearms because they are they're used relatively infrequently in crime. You mentioned that the one statistic that pops out that's only 8% involved firearms. That's true, but that's all crime. That's not necessarily the crimes that people are typically worried about, thinking of being violent crime, whether it is robbery, assault, murder, attempted murder, those sorts of things. I'm not sure what the statistic in the long run means, except that you're kind of diminishing the argument that that guns play an important part in crime. I think that that's not necessarily the most convincing argument. That, for instance, assault, none of this is specific to assault rifles anyway. I thought that was, the whole position that you were taking in the proposition was that bans on assault rifles don't seem to have much effect, but none of I don't even know that the Washington law that you're talking about affected assault rifles, and so as a consequence, even the examples that you're presenting are a little bit uncertain to the claim that you're making. At one point, there's a suggestion toward the end that says people would just get access through black markets, but that's an assertion. There's no evidence there. I think that if that's going to be an argument, it needs to be developed. All right. Thank you.